Very much, Phil. Bill?
This city and every capital in the world is completely oblivious to the fact that it is caught up in a change in warfare so great that it not only makes our current defense and foreign policies obsolete, it essentially makes obsolete the whole framework within which we think about defense and foreign policy. And what I want to do today here for a bit is talk about this change in war and its implications for policy. The change is what I call the rise of fourth generation war. And this is specifically the fourth generation of modern war. Well, what do we mean by modern war? We mean war since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. What Westphalia did was it gave the state a monopoly on war. First in Europe, and then as European influence spread around the globe, the state said there can be no armed elements fighting out there that are legitimate, that are not forces of the state. If you look at woodcuts of Germany after the Westphalia, you see the trees are festooned with corpses. Those were soldiers who didn't belong to state militaries. To the cheers of the population, what was left of it after the 30 Years' War, state armies went out, rounded them up, and hanged them from the nearest tree. We now think of foreign affairs and defense totally within the framework of the state. State armed forces are designed to fight other state armed forces, but look pretty similar. Uniforms, flags, tanks, aircraft, submarines, what have you. And they fight according to elaborate systems of rules. And again, we heard a bit this morning about jus in bello and so on. It's become at this point, state-on-state warfare is pretty much a jousting contest. And that's a sign, because when one stage of warfare reaches that point, where the knights essentially are only useful for tournaments, it means those musketeers out there that nobody wants to pay any attention to are becoming kind of important. And that's exactly what's happening today. What we have forgotten because of Westphalia, and because that we have been in the Westphalian system now for 350 years, with foreign policy as well, the State Department thinks solely about dealing with other states, is that before Westphalia, that's not how war worked. Through almost all of human history, war was fought by a wide variety of entities. Families fought wars, Montague and Capulet. Tribes fought wars, clans fought wars, cities fought wars, ethnic groups and races fought wars, cultures fought wars, religions fought lots and lots of wars. Business enterprises, legal and illegal, fought wars. Britain didn't conquer India. India was conquered by the British East India Company, a business enterprise with an army and a fleet. And this was as late as the 18th century, well after Westphalia. The whole system, and again, the whole framework within which we consider defense and foreign policy, is reflective of this fundamental reality. But that reality is changing. What's happening around the world today, in more and more places, is that state armed forces find themselves fighting not other state armed forces, but fourth generation forces, non-state forces. Groups of fighters who, as in the old days, are fighting for many different kinds of reasons, from impressing the local girls to achieving local salvation, achieving eternal salvation. They represent, once again, clans, tribes, families, business enterprises, races, ethnic groups, religions, the whole old broad spread basis of war, where there is very little line, if any, between war and crime, is coming back. The pre-Westphalian order is coming back. The Westphalian order is failing. And almost everywhere, when state armed forces meet the physically ridiculously inferior Fourth-generation war opponents, they lose. I talk a lot to Marine Corps audiences, and I tell them, you guys are at this point 0-4 against guys in bathrobes and flip-flops armed with rusty AKs, whose resources, if graphed on the same scale as our own, would not be visible. This should be telling you something. It is, by the way, within the Marine Corps now up through the rank of colonel, but headquarters, the brass, they think about nothing but money. This is true of all of our services. Why is this happening? The fundamental reason is the state finds itself in an ever-deepening crisis of legitimacy. And this gets very much to what Phil was talking about with the deep state. The state has become, in more and more countries, including here, and of course the crisis of legitimacy, though it's universal, varies greatly in intensity. And it's not the same here as it is, say, in West Africa. But it's developing everywhere because the state has become the private hunting preserve of what I call the establishment. Again, very much the deep state you're talking about. Everybody knows the Washington establishment here, the two parties that are really one party, the establishment party. The Republican Democrat stuff, the elections, it's all just kabuki for the rubes out in flyover land. The one thing we can be certain of is that the next president will be a member of the establishment, and nothing will change. The public, as it's making very evident here and in Europe, is increasingly anxious for non-establishment alternatives. I can assure you it won't get them. In response to this establishment that has four basic characteristics, first, it can't make things work. If we look at our foreign and defense policy, it is one of serial failure. We go into a place in the Middle East, we wreck the state, destroy the state, no one can rebuild it, we end up fighting in a petri dish of fourth-generation war forces that we have created, we lose, and we go on to do the same thing again somewhere else. The establishment exempts itself from the consequences of its own failures. It wrecks the public schools, but its kids go to private schools. There's no security. The reason the state arose was to provide security for the people who live in much of the city of Washington, D.C., but the establishment lives in gated communities. Third, it cares only about remaining the establishment. What happens to the rest of the society is really of very little concern. Colonel John Boyd, the great American military theorist and reformer, said one of the most important questions everyone faces in life, usually early in life, is do you want to be something or do you want to do something? The establishment is made up almost entirely of people who want to be something. They want to be a member of the establishment, and they have spent decades kissing every ass in creation to get there. Well, they're not about to risk their membership in the establishment. I said to my old boss, Senator Gary Hart, over breakfast in Denver a few years ago, if you're a member of the establishment and you suggest more than 5 degrees rudder change in anything, you instantly cease to be a member of the establishment. And he said, I'm Exhibit A. And then in many countries, including here, including most of Western Europe, there's a fourth element. To be a member of the establishment, you must at least acquiesce to the state ideology. That ideology is what we commonly know as political correctness. It is, in fact, the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School. And that ideology's goal, from its initial conception, independently by Gramsci in Italy and Lukács in Hungary in 1919, has been the destruction of Western culture and the Christian religion. So you now have an establishment that cares only about itself, cannot be kicked out, cannot adjust, learn, or adapt, and has its fundamental characteristic, it is at war with the whole heritage of the society and a majority and the beliefs of a majority of its citizens. Now, is there any surprise at this point we have a legitimacy crisis of the state? And so here, as elsewhere, what people are doing is they are transferring their primary loyalty away from the state, again, to all those other pre-Westphalian causes and loyalties for which people then fought and for which they're fighting again. It's happening here as it's happening all around the world. What does this mean for defense and foreign policy? Well, again, the discussion is almost irrelevant because the establishment will not and cannot change. Some countries in Europe actually have the option of voting the establishment out. They can vote for the National Front in France. They can vote for the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. They can vote for UK Independence Party. And guess what? They're doing so. The real Conservative Party just came in tops in the last election in Switzerland. One of its campaign posters showed 3 white sheep kicking a black sheep over the border. They weren't subtle about it. But we need to know ourselves, as intellectuals, as people interested in this, okay, what should we do to cope with this phenomenon? Well, obviously, the most important thing is reform at home so that we do create legal ways, practical political ways that the public can kick out the establishment and can actually elect a Trump or a Sanders or someone else who really would change things. In defense and foreign policy, almost all the money we're spending on defense, which is about $1 trillion a year, is complete waste. Why? Because A, these forces can't win fourth-generation wars, and the more high-tech stuff they get, the faster they're defeated. B, if we go to war against another state and we win, the other state disintegrates, and we have created yet another region dominated by fourth-generation forces, which will be a far worse problem for us than the state that we went to war against in the first place. Israel, by the way, has created an enormous mess for itself in its neighborhood for precisely this reason. The non-state forces that are now rising all around it in its region, which it did a lot to bring about, are far worse dangers to it than the sclerotic states that they faced before. We need not to be preparing for wars with other states, but to be creating an alliance of all states against non-state forces. War between states is strategically obsolete. No matter what the outcome is, in the end, you lose. So why are we preparing at the cost of $1 trillion a year to fight those kinds of wars? Why are we funding $1 trillion a year for a military that can't and won't even think about fourth-generation warfare because all of its fancy big weapons projects are useless in it? We say we need the F-22 fighter in Afghanistan to shoot down Taliban flying carpets. What we need is an alliance of all states against non-state forces. And instead of our usual cats and dogs collection from the local SPCA of allies, Obama proclaiming, we stand with Romania, we stand with Slovakia, we stand with Ruritania and Graustark. There are only 2 countries out there that can make a real difference for us, that can do something for us instead of us only doing things for them. Those 2, obviously, are Russia and China. So what are we doing today? Our utmost to alienate both Russia and China. Nothing could better illustrate the complete obsolescence, the complete detachment from reality of the cloud cuckoo land, as the Germans say, of this city, than the fact that we are doing our best to get into very serious quarrels with the other 2 great powers, Russia and China. None of this will change until 2 things happen. First, the money runs out. Now, the good news here is the money already has run out. Both parties on the Hill are whistling through the graveyard by just borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. We borrow to finance the Democrats' spending programs. We borrow to finance the Republicans' tax cuts and, of course, their worship of the Pentagon. As Paul Ryan has said, we are going to have a debt crisis. And when that hits, and we can't borrow anymore, then the money flow is going to stop. And this vast defense structure we've built that puts out almost nothing in the way of combat power, it's just the grandest middle and upper class welfare scheme ever conceived, that all dries up and blows away because the money isn't there anymore. And at that point, the establishment, including the deep state, are in trouble because they all function on tons and tons of money. They require vast amounts of money. At that point, the second thing becomes possible that we need if we are going to readjust to a world of the decline of the state, and that is we kick the establishment out and we bring in some people who actually are connected with reality. I mean, if we look at Moscow today, why is it that as we play a strong hand poorly, they play a real hand well? Well, Moscow's living in the real world. You know, Putin's pretty much a realist. So are the Chinese. At some point, we either have to kick the establishment out and reestablish policies that are based on reality, or when the establishment goes, it will take the state itself with it here.
Thanks, Bill.